Okay, simple summary for week 4. So, what this module is about is the Great Depression, which, if you're not familiar, is possibly one of the worst times in American history when millions of businesses went out of business and banks went out of business and people lost their jobs, people lost their homes. It was a very, very dark time. And we had a government that really should have been much better than it was at alleviating people's suffering. Um, Herbert Hoover had been elected in a landslide in 1928. And I think if you were going to look for anybody in recent American history who should have been great at dealing with the Great Depression as president, it should have been Herbert Hoover. He had been deeply involved in making sure that the people of Europe didn't starve to death after World War I, when Europe was in complete wreckage. He had led a large government-sponsored humanitarian effort to make sure that people were okay. And so 10 years later, when he's the Republican nominee for president, he could run on that. He did run on that experience and his other experience in the government as Secretary of Commerce. He really, in terms of his biography, should have been a great president. But, what's written on the page isn't the whole story. And so when the Great Depression came along, he was not well equipped to deal with it at all. And it's hard to even explain why, but suffice it to say, he didn't do enough. And so the millions of people around the country who had voted for him were very disappointed. And there were a great many people living in tents and living in boxes, especially in Washington, D.C. And the nickname that people gave those things were Hoovervilles. Like, they blamed him for, why aren't you doing anything? So Hoover was not the answer to the Great Depression. And ironically, what turned out to be the answer, relatively speaking, was an unlikely person, because the person who replaced him as president by winning the election in 1932 was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now rewind a few years, okay? Franklin is the younger cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. They're not brothers, they're not father-son, they're cousins, and they were friendly. Theodore had attended Franklin's wedding because he was actually related to Franklin's wife. It sounds weird since they're all named Roosevelt, but they're distant cousins. It's nothing weird. And Franklin had idealized Theodore and wanted to be like him, like a lot of people did back then. Theodore was a Republican, Franklin was a Democrat. But a lot of people saw Franklin rise and begin to move up in government and thought, oh, he's going to be president someday like Theodore was. And in fact, they had a lot of the same background. They both went to Harvard. They both had been state legislators in their home state of New York. Both were on their rise up through government, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then in 1920, another similarity. Theodore Roosevelt had been vice president once. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt was nominated for vice president. But the difference, this is where the path diverges, because not only did the Democratic ticket lose and Franklin Roosevelt not get elected, a year or two later, he was crippled with a terrible disease. Now, you may not even heard the term polio, because we have basically eradicated that disease with a vaccine now that was invented in the 50s. But at the time, this was something that killed a lot of people, especially young boys and girls. It was typically a childhood disease. And it was strange that an adult would contract it, but young, what is he, late 30s, early, about 40, which I know is not young to you, but as a politician, that's very young, should get this disease and suffer serious health problems from it was very unlikely. And nobody quite knows how he got it, but he went from being healthy, mobile, energetic person who played a lot of sports, who was always dashing around doing things, to being in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And he fought very hard to get out of that wheelchair. He sought whatever treatments he could find. He went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, because he heard that the warm spring water there was helping people rehabilitate who had suffered from polio. He was wealthy. He had the best medicine could offer, but nothing changed, and he never walked again the rest of his life. And when this happened, he thought not only was his political career over, he thought his life was over. And I mean, he couldn't do anything by himself anymore. And he lived in a big, beautiful house in Hyde Park, New York. I've been there a few times, and it's and you can visit there now. That's where his presidential library is. And there's a long, long driveway out to the mailbox. And there's a story about how he was trying to kind of rehabilitate himself. And so he got these steel braces and put them around his legs, and they would lock in place, like lock his legs straight, so that he could sort of walk. It's not really walking, but with those braces and with like canes or short leg supports, he could sort of walk. And one of the ways that he built up his tolerance for this, which was a very painful thing, imagine like metal just strapped so tightly to your legs so that it can hold you up, that the straps are cutting into your flesh. It was very painful. But he wanted to be able to walk, or at least give the appearance of walking, and so he started practicing, and he would make his way as far as his goal was very simple: make it eventually to the end of the driveway and back. And he practiced that for a long time and eventually built up enough tolerance that he could do that, although most of the time he was in a wheelchair. People did not understand that he had no use of his legs. They knew he had been ill. They knew he had some sort of difficulty walking. They did not realize that he was paralyzed from the waist down. And the newspapers didn't go out of their way to print that. It was a different time. That was considered to largely be a private thing. If you got sick and lost your legs to polio, they didn't print that. If you had a wife and a girlfriend, and the reporters knew about it, they didn't print things about the girlfriend. It was a different time. I'm not saying that any of that was right, but I'm just saying it was a different time. And oh, by the way, Franklin did have a wife and a girlfriend, and I'll tell you why I'm telling you that in a second. The paralysis that he suffered derailed his political career. He had intended to run for governor of New York, and he couldn't do it. And someone else became governor of New York, and he agreed later on to nominate that person for president, because when you're governor of New York, you're almost automatically a legitimate candidate for president if you want to be. So Franklin had overcome a couple of obstacles. Obviously, the polio was one thing, and learning to navigate either the steel braces or getting a powerful upper body from pushing himself around in a wheelchair. He had also overcome some personal difficulties. He did, after marrying his wife Eleanor, later on fall in love with somebody else, and they carried on a passionate affair until Mrs. Roosevelt discovered the love letters. And so for a while they were talking about divorce, and eventually they agreed to stay together for the sake of the children, but with the understanding that Franklin would never see this woman again. Her name was Lucy Mercer. And so that's just a little foreshadowing of a story that I'll be telling you later on about FDR, if I hopefully get to it. Spoiler alert, on the last day of Franklin Roosevelt's life, April 12th, 1945, the anniversary of which is coming up soon, um, right before he had the cerebral hemorrhage that killed him, um, he was with a few staff members and employees at his home in Warm Spring, Georgia, but sitting with him was not Mrs. Roosevelt, but Lucy Mercer Rutherford, his former girlfriend. Anyway, the point of these two connecting pieces is that the nation, the United States, metaphorically speaking, was knocked down by the Great Depression, right? It just knocked the wind out of the country. Again, millions of people out of work, millions of people homeless, the economy's shuttered. Think about how scary it is to have money in the bank and you go to the bank and it's closed and out of business, right? And then the second half of this is this person who seems to be cruising along and then out of nowhere gets polio and it wrecks him. But think about it this way. How perfect, in terms of casting, in terms of the story, is it for Franklin Roosevelt to overcome polio and learn to live with it and become president and be the one to bring this country back from the Great Depression? That is what he did. The New Deal, which was his legislative program, you can criticize it. There's plenty of criticism to be made, but it definitely improved people's lives. It put people back to work. It stabilized the economy. It created things to make sure that your money in a bank is safe. To this day, your money is safe in a bank because of something called the FDIC. And that government agency was created by Franklin Roosevelt during his presidency, which was often called the New Deal. And so it's a comeback story. It's like a Rocky movie in real life in a way. If you think about it, it's a comeback story. And so that is the connection between Franklin Roosevelt's personal life, where he had to overcome this disease, polio, and his ability to lead the country back from its severe challenge in terms of the Great Depression. Okay, write this up. Write a summary separate from the questions. Write a summary of the overall video of what you heard here and what the basic events are, and then specifically answer the questions. Okay.